He thought it was just another rainy Monday, until a woman collapsed on his porch and a little girl stood there completely still. It started on a Monday morning when the sky over Willow Creek hung low with a quiet kind of grief, and the rain wasn't loud, just steady, like it had been falling for years without anyone noticing. Cal Dawson had just stepped onto his porch with a chipped mug of black coffee when he saw them. A woman and a little girl standing beneath the overhang, like shadows pressed flat against the wood. The girl wasn't crying. She wasn't even blinking, just standing barefoot, her small hands clutching the hem of the woman's coat, eyes wide and dry like they had already run out of tears. The woman didn't say much, only asked if they could stay until the rain let up. Something in her voice, controlled, quiet yet trembling beneath, made Cal nod before he even realized it. He didn't know their names. He didn't ask where they'd come from. All he knew as he stepped back into the house and left the door open was that they looked like people who had been walking a long way with nowhere left to go, and for some reason, he wanted them to stay. Cal Dawson had lived alone for nearly 7 years in the weather-beaten wooden house at the edge of Willow Creek, just where the paved road faded into gravel and the gravel gave way to mud when it rained. His mailbox leaned left like an old man with bad knees, and the red flag hadn't been lifted in months. He didn't get letters. He didn't send any. The roof needed fixing and the porch had begun to splinter near the steps, but Cal patched things just enough to keep nature out and silence in. He liked silence. It was cleaner than conversation, more honest than comfort. People in town still remembered him vaguely, the Dawson boy, they'd say, though he was 43 and graying at the temples with shoulders that curved slightly from years of working jobs that didn't require talking. He shopped at the feed store once a week, nodded to folks without speaking, and drove home before anyone could ask how he was. The truth was, Cal had stopped thinking about how he was. Days passed quietly. He chopped wood, kept the fire going, listened to local radio while cooking simple meals, and sometimes on cold nights he'd sit on the porch and watch the trees breathe in the wind like they were exhaling memories he wasn't ready to hold. There were no pictures on his walls, no visitors, no birthday cards, not even from the church ladies who once brought casserole after his brother Jason died. They'd stopped coming when it became clear Cal didn't want prayers, only privacy. He didn't drink much, didn't smoke, didn't own a dog. The only living thing that shared his space was a squirrel that had chewed its way into the attic one winter, and after a brief standoff was allowed to stay so long as it didn't scratch too loudly. To anyone else it might have looked like loneliness, but to Cal, it was earned stillness. A kind of penance, maybe. He never called it that. Never called it anything at all, just kept waking up and doing the next thing. He didn't need much, just quiet, and a space wide enough to keep the past from touching him. That morning, when the clouds swelled dark and the trees trembled as if they knew what was coming, Cal stood barefoot in the doorway, sipping lukewarm coffee, and he felt for the first time in a long time that something was about to change. Something was coming down the road. Something he hadn't asked for but wouldn't be able to ignore. It wasn't the sound of the rain that made Cal turn, it was the absence of everything else. The birds had gone quiet. The wind paused like it was holding its breath, and even the trees, normally restless in the Arkansas spring, stood still, as if they too were listening. Cal stepped out onto the porch, coffee still in hand, and that's when he saw them. A young woman and a small girl, barely more than a shadow against her side, standing just beneath the edge of his overhang, trying not to be seen. The woman's coat was soaked down to the hem, clinging to her like it had been rained on for days, and the girl wasn't wearing a coat at all, just a threadbare sweater and jeans, several inches too short, her toes bare against the damp boards. The woman kept her eyes down, one hand lightly touching the child's shoulder, the other gripping the strap of a faded canvas bag slung across her body. She looked like she had been waiting for him to notice, but dreading the moment he did. When Cal stepped forward, she didn't flinch, but the little girl instinctively pressed closer to her, half hiding behind the folds of wet fabric, watching him with enormous, unreadable eyes. "We're not here to bother you," the woman said softly. voice barely audible over the hush of falling rain, just until it slows. We'll be gone before you know it. Cal didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to being spoken to at all, much less on his own porch by strangers. Something about her tone, though, firm but cautious, tired but not defeated, stirred something deep in him he couldn't quite name. He looked at the girl again. She hadn't blinked once. She wasn't crying or shivering or clinging in fear. She was just there, completely still, like a drawing on the side of a wall that rain couldn't wash away. Cal nodded slowly, then stepped back toward the door. "You can come in," he said, not sure if he meant it or just said it because it was true. He left the door open behind him and didn't look back to see if they followed. But he heard the soft scuff of small feet against wood, the creak of the porch under weight that wasn't his own, and the whisper of the storm shifting just slightly to make room for something new. She didn't step inside right away, not even after Cal had left the door open behind him. The woman stood there a moment longer, as if calculating the weight of the gesture. The risk of entering a stranger's home balanced against the weariness in her bones and the way the rain soaked straight through her daughter's sweater. Finally, she looked down at the little girl, brushed a strand of wet hair from her forehead, and gave the barest nod. The girl didn't speak, just followed, silent and precise in the way children are when they've been taught not to draw attention. They stepped through the doorway together, dripping quietly onto the wooden floor, their presence almost too soft to disturb the air. Cal didn't say anything as he moved to the small kitchen and set another chipped mug down on the table. He didn't offer food or comfort. He simply gestured with his chin toward the dry towels stacked on a chair near the stove. She took one without asking, gently wrapped the girl's shoulders, and only then looked up at him with eyes that were sharper than he expected. "We'll go when the rain stops," she said, her voice steadier this time, but still wrapped in apology. "We don't mean to trouble you. Just needed someplace dry." Cal gave a short shrug, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to say it wasn't trouble. It was strange, this sudden shift in routine, the quiet of the house now filled with new breaths, faint shuffles, the whisper of damp clothes against wood. He hadn't shared space with anyone in years, and yet it didn't feel intrusive. It felt inevitable. The woman kept glancing at the girl who had found a spot near the stove and was crouched beside the warmth, not speaking, not crying, just watching the orange light flicker inside. Cal studied her for a moment, small, delicate, with eyes too old for her face. Then he looked back at the woman. "Name's Cal," he said, almost surprised to hear himself speak. She hesitated. "Ellie," she replied after a moment, "and this is Grace." He nodded once. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, not in cold but in habit, and glanced toward the window. The rain wasn't slowing. It tapped steadily against the glass, like it had all morning, steady and unrelenting. Cal knew then they wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. And for some reason he couldn't explain, that thought didn't bother him at all. Cal wasn't the kind of man who studied people he'd spent most of his life avoiding the need, but over the next couple of days, as the rain lingered and the sky refused to clear, he found himself quietly observing the woman and the girl who had taken up unspoken residence at the edges of his space. Ellie Monroe didn't talk much. She moved carefully through the house like someone who had learned the hard way that even safe places could collapse without warning. She didn't ask questions, didn't touch what wasn't hers. And when she used something, one of Cal's old mugs, a folded blanket from the back room, she always returned it exactly as she'd found it, as if trying to erase any trace of her presence. Grace, the little girl, was even quieter. She didn't speak at all, not even to her mother. She followed Ellie like a shadow, keeping within reach, but never clinging, and when she wasn't sleeping, curled up on the couch or sitting cross-legged by the stove, she would draw on scrap paper old receipts, whatever Cal happened to have near the kitchen. Her drawings weren't childlike scribbles. They were careful, detailed, hauntingly precise, the stove's rusted handle, the chipped tile near the back door, Cal's boots drying by the wall. She seemed to see everything, catalog everything, but never spoke a word about any of it. Cal never asked why. He figured silence was a kind of language, and both of them spoke it fluently. Ellie never explained what they were running from, or if they were running at all. She never offered a backstory, and Cal didn't press. But he noticed the way her eyes scanned the road each time a car passed. The way she folded Grace's clothes with near-military precision, the way she flinched ever so slightly whenever a floorboard creaked too loudly. These weren't habits of someone just caught in a storm. These were the instincts of someone used to disappearing. At night, Cal would hear them whispering softly in the back room. He'd given them the murmur of a bedtime ritual that required no lights, no stories, only the comfort of knowing they were still together. And in the mornings, Ellie would make coffee without asking, pour it into his old thermos, and leave it by the sink like she'd always been there. Cal didn't understand it, not yet, but he felt the quiet of the house beginning to shift, stretch, take on a new shape. It wasn't just his anymore. It belonged in some strange and wordless way to all three of them. It was on the fourth morning just after sunrise when Cal stepped out to check the shed and spotted movement beyond the tree line at the back of the property. Subtle quiet, barely more than a flicker of motion where there should have been nothing. His land ran long and narrow, bordered by thickets and an overgrown path that used to be a service road, and he hadn't thought to patrol it in months. But something pulled him that way. Some instinct that had grown sharper since Ellie and Grace had arrived, something that said, "Look again." As he walked toward the edge of the trees, he saw it, a rusted-out station wagon, sunken into the earth like it had been there for years, its paint flaking off in dull red sheets, the windows fogged from the inside. At first he assumed it had been dumped there long ago, another casualty of someone else's forgotten life. But then he saw the soft imprint of bare feet in the damp grass, the worn grocery bag folded under the front wheel, and a small pair of socks laid out neatly on the dashboard to dry. He moved closer quietly, and through the haze of the window, he could make out the outlines of blankets, a child's backpack, an empty thermos. There were no lights, no signs of a campfire or supplies, just the unmistakable evidence of someone surviving, not living. Cal stood there for a long moment, not angry, not even surprised, just still. It all made sense now, the way Ellie never quite unpacked her bag, how Grace never asked for toys or treats, the subtle weariness in Ellie's shoulders even when she was sitting. They hadn't come from the rain. They had been living in it. He didn't knock, didn't open the door. He turned and walked back to the house, and that night, without saying anything, he left a folded wool blanket and 2 candles on the back porch, just far enough for her to find them, just close enough to say he knew. The next morning the blanket was gone, the candles too, but when he came into the kitchen, a small bundle of wildflowers sat on the windowsill, half-crushed, imperfect, beautiful in their awkward sincerity. He didn't speak of the car, neither did she, but something shifted between them, a quiet acknowledgement, not of pity, but of truth. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't even asked to be seen. But now she was, and he didn't look away. That week, Cal began leaving small things by the back door, not because she asked, not because he felt obligated, but because something in him understood the quiet arrangement they had fallen into, and he couldn't pretend not to see the shape of her struggle now that he'd walked straight into it. First, it was the wool blanket from his closet, the one he hadn't used since his brother passed. Then came the food, nothing fancy, just a loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper, a jar of peanut butter, some apples, and once a few hard-boiled eggs tucked neatly into a tin. He left them in silence, never knocking, never waiting. She never spoke of them when they returned to the house during the day, never said thank you, but she always returned the containers cleaned, wrapped in a dish towel, and set precisely in the corner of the kitchen table, as if that too were part of the deal. There was no discussion, no explanation. It was as if both of them had agreed that naming the situation might break it, that kindness could only survive between them if it remained unnamed. Ellie never told him why they had been living in that rusted car or what had driven her and Grace into such quiet exile, and Cal never asked, not because he wasn't curious he was, but because he sensed that whatever had pushed her to the edge of his property had already taken enough from her. He wasn't going to be the one to demand more. Grace remained the same, observant, silent, often still, but there was something in her posture that began to loosen ever so slightly. She sat closer to the stove now, sometimes picked at the edges of bread with her fingers, and one afternoon without a word she drew a picture of Cal standing in the kitchen holding a frying pan. She left it on his workbench like it was just another object that belonged in his space. He found it after they'd gone out again, stared at it longer than he intended, and placed it in the drawer with the screwdriver he never used. These exchanges, blankets for flowers, food for pictures, silence for shelter, became their way of talking. They didn't need to explain who they were or where they came from. Cal didn't need her story. He just needed her to keep coming back. And she did. Every morning she returned, Grace trailing quietly behind her, and though they never said it aloud, something between them had shifted. She no longer stood on the edge of the porch. She stepped through the door without hesitation. Grace didn't speak, not once, not even in a whisper to her mother, but she drew constantly, obsessively, with a focus so intense it made her seem older than her size would suggest. Cal began to notice it one afternoon when he found a folded piece of paper left on the windowsill above the sink. At first he thought it was one of the old bills he'd forgotten to throw out, but when he unfolded it, he saw himself standing at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up back, slightly hunched, washing a plate beneath a thin stream of water. The detail startled him. The lines were simple, drawn in pencil, but the likeness was unmistakable: the shape of his shoulders, the cracked edge of the counter, even the steam curling faintly from the basin. It wasn't the work of a casual child's hand. It was observation turned into memory, and memory turned into proof. Over the next few days the drawings kept coming. She didn't hand them to him. She left them on the porch swing on the armrest of his chair, once even tucked between the pages of the local paper he hadn't read in years. Each one was a small glimpse into her gaze, into how much she noticed, and how deeply she saw. There was the front porch drawn from an angle only someone sitting on the bottom step could see, capturing the uneven grain of the wood, the slouching screen door, the chipped paint on the railing. Another showed the big maple tree near the road, its branches stretching wide like tired arms, with a single crow perched near the top mid-screech. But the ones that stopped him were always the ones of himself, not because he looked good in them, but because he looked real. She drew him as he was a man in solitude, unaware of being watched sometimes, weary, sometimes just there. One morning he found a picture of him bent over the stove, stirring a pot with one hand, the other bracing against the counter. She had captured even the rag in his back pocket, the slight tilt of his head, the way his jaw tensed when he concentrated. He kept that one. Didn't say anything, just folded it once slowly and slid it into the drawer with her earlier sketches. Grace never smiled when she handed over her work. If anything, she avoided his eyes, but she always watched his hands as he unfolded them, as if waiting for some kind of unspoken verdict. He never gave one. Instead, he would glance at her, nod once, and return to whatever task he'd been doing. It became their language: pictures in place of words, attention in place of affection, presence in place of promises. And somehow, it was enough. It was near the end of the week when Ellie finally broke the silence that had stretched between her and Cal like an invisible thread, tense, respectful, untested. She stood in the kitchen, hands tucked into the sleeves of a too-thin cardigan, eyes fixed not on him, but on the dish rack by the sink. Through the screen door, he listened to the sound of water running, of plates clinking against one another, of someone trying to repay something that had never been charged. She washed carefully, methodically, like it was her job, which in her mind maybe it was, and when she finished, she dried every dish and stacked them neatly, wiped the counters, and swept the corner of the kitchen where Grace had left a trail of leaves. That night, Cal noticed she had left a note on the counter, written in a tight, deliberate hand. "Thanks for letting us stay. I'll help however I can, just until the weather clears." She signed it with an E, nothing more. She didn't mention Grace didn't ask for anything else. It was a transaction, or at least she tried to make it one, a clean trade of labor for space usefulness, for mercy. But Cal didn't see it that way. He knew what it looked like when someone tried to earn what they were too proud to beg for. He knew about the car parked out past the tree line, knew they were still sleeping out there most nights, even as the temperatures dropped and the mud thickened under the wheels. And yet they returned to his porch every day, and over time it stopped feeling like an intrusion. It became routine. Ellie would knock once, soft, more a courtesy than a request, and then ease the door open without waiting. Grace followed close behind, clutching a new piece of paper, or a found object, a pine cone, a feather, a small, smooth stone she'd discovered somewhere on Cal's land. She never said anything, just placed her offering on the windowsill or table before disappearing into her corner by the stove. Ellie would head straight for the sink, roll up her sleeves, and begin washing whatever Cal had left behind. He didn't leave things dirty on purpose, but he also stopped rushing to clean them himself. Something about her presence made him slow down, made the house feel less like a holding pen for a man who'd given up, and more like a place where days passed with purpose. They didn't talk much, just enough to exchange small facts: how cold the night had been, whether the creek was rising, whether Grace had eaten. But even those fragments became anchors. Some nights Cal would find a second plate already set at the table when he returned from chopping wood. Other times Ellie would leave behind a stack of folded towels or scrub the floor near the back door, where his boots always dragged in dirt. None of it was asked for, none of it expected. And yet day after day they came back, not because he had offered them shelter, but because he had let them exist without question. And that perhaps was the first real kindness either of them had been given in a very long time. It was late in the evening when Ellie finally told him, her voice low and steady, the kind of steady that only comes from rehearsing the truth in your head too many times. Grace was asleep on the couch, curled into herself beneath one of Cal's old quilts, her tiny form barely making a dent in the cushions. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft, flickering glow across the kitchen, and Cal was wiping down the stove when Ellie, without prompting or eye contact, said, "She doesn't have a birth certificate." Cal paused, cloth in hand, but didn't turn. He'd learned by now that when Ellie spoke, it was because the words had worked their way loose, not because she needed a response. "We moved around a lot when she was born," she continued, her tone almost clinical, like she was reading off a checklist of failures. "I wasn't thinking straight back then. No papers, no registration, no pediatrician. I didn't even take her to the hospital when she had that fever at 3. Cal still said nothing, but he had stopped wiping. She pressed on, voice a little more brittle now. "We've never been on any kind of insurance. No school either. Every time I filled out a form, I thought, what if someone notices? What if someone asks where her records are? And then they start digging, and then it's over." Her fingers were wrapped tightly around the edge of the table, knuckles pale. "I taught her myself letters, numbers, reading. She's smart, smarter than I ever was. But she's invisible on paper. If something happened to me..." Her voice caught then, not from emotion, but exhaustion, and she took a breath before continuing. "There's no system that would recognize her, no name to trace. She's not even real to them." Cal finally turned to look at her. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, tired in her bones, in her spine, in the parts of her that had spent years watching over her shoulder. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly, not accusing, just curious. Ellie shrugged, her eyes still on the table. "Because I think you already knew. And because if we stay here much longer, someone's going to notice. And when they do, they'll ask questions I can't answer." Cal didn't say anything then. He just looked over at Grace, still sleeping soundly beneath the quilt, and something inside him shifted again, slow and irreversible, like the earth moving under your feet without warning. The next morning, without saying much, Cal told Ellie to bring Grace and get in the truck. She hesitated, wary as always, but something in his voice firm, but not forceful, like a rope being extended rather than a line being drawn, made her nod. Grace didn't ask where they were going. She simply climbed into the back seat, clutching her sketchpad like it was a shield. The ride was quiet, the road long and winding as they left Willow Creek behind and headed toward the next town over where Cal knew there was a community center that sometimes helped folks in tough spots. No questions asked, or at least not too many. The building was modest, tucked between a post office and an old barber shop, its windows lined with faded flyers for after-school programs and free flu shots. Inside, the warmth hit them like a blanket coffee brewing fluorescent lights, humming the low murmur of conversation from a few scattered volunteers. Cal signed them in, gave Ellie a look that said, "Trust me," and they waited in a corner while Grace sat on a plastic chair, drawing something quietly, always drawing. After a few minutes, a woman in a red cardigan and sensible shoes called their name. She introduced herself as Paula said she was one of the intake coordinators and ushered them into a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a bowl of wrapped candies that Grace stared at but didn't touch. Paula smiled warmly, flipping open a notepad. So she began looking from Cal to Ellie. "We'll start with the basics. Just a few details to get you in the system, maybe connect you to housing or legal aid if that's something you're open to." Ellie nodded, eyes cautious. "Name Ellie Monroe," she said quietly. Paula scribbled, and the child's name, Grace. Another scribble. Then Paula looked up, her tone still gentle but edged with bureaucratic expectation. "And the father, what's his name? Is he in the picture?" Ellie froze. Cal felt her body stiffen beside him. Her jaw tensed, and for a moment he thought she might lie or shut down completely. But instead she exhaled slowly, like she was letting go of something that had been pressing on her chest for far too long. "There is no father," she said, voice flat. "Not in any way that counts." Paula glanced up, lips pursed, then nodded without asking more. But the question lingered in the air even after the pen scratched forward like a ghost that refused to leave quietly even after you said its name. Ellie didn't say much after the meeting with the intake coordinator. As they left the community center, her steps were brisk, her shoulders tight, and her eyes fixed on the pavement like it might unravel if she dared to look up. Cal didn't press her. He'd seen this posture before, not just in her, but in people who had learned that silence was safer than explanation, that withholding truth was often the only form of control left when the rest of your life had been carved open by someone else's decisions. They drove back in the same quiet they'd left, with Grace curled up in the back seat, sketching the outline of a ceiling fan she'd seen in the waiting room. The sun was dipping low when they pulled up to the house, that familiar wooden frame catching the golden light like it had been waiting to exhale. Ellie moved quickly, ushering Grace inside, muttering something about warming up soup. But Cal didn't follow. He lingered on the porch, something tugging at his mind, not a word. Not a feeling exactly, but a shadow of memory. And then he saw it. In the stack of brochures Paula had handed them earlier, mostly pamphlets about local food banks and schooling options, there was one form partially filled out, slipped between the pages like it had been forgotten or never meant to be seen. It was in Ellie's handwriting, unmistakable in its tight, slanted strokes. The top was blank, but at the bottom, just above the line marked "Biological Father," was a name, Jason Reed. Cal stared at it for a long time. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name that still echoed sometimes in the hallways of his memory when the wind hit the trees just right. Jason Reed, his brother. The one who'd left town, disappeared into addiction silence, and eventually a grave 6 winters ago. The one Cal had buried in a storm, not unlike the one that had brought Ellie and Grace to his porch. He folded the paper slowly, carefully, and slid it back into the stack as if by hiding it he could delay what it meant. Ellie hadn't said a word about Jason, not once, not during the drives, not while Grace slept on his couch, not even when she told him about the birth certificate, the school forms, the fear. And yet now, here it was, a truth sitting quietly between them, patient and waiting. Cal didn't go inside right away. He sat on the porch with the cold creeping into his bones, watching the sun bleed out behind the hills, knowing that whatever silence they'd built together was about to crack. That night, long after the house had gone still, and only the wind outside stirred the brittle leaves clinging to the porch rails, Cal sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold, turning the name Jason Reed over in his mind, like a stone he couldn't put down. The name didn't just belong to a memory, it was a wound long scarred over but never healed. Jason hadn't always been a ghost. There was a time when he was the brightest light Cal knew. They'd grown up together like brothers, though not by blood, more by circumstance and sheer stubborn loyalty. Jason had been fire to Cal's earth, wild and restless, always chasing something bigger, louder, faster. Cal had been the one to pull him back when he went too far, to patch things up when Jason's mouth or fists got ahead of his sense. But that balance didn't hold forever. Cal could still remember the last call clear as glass even after all these years. It was late past midnight, the rain tapping the roof in the kind of rhythm that made everything feel thinner. Jason's voice on the other end had been slurred but not drunk broken. "I messed up, Cal," he'd said. "I'm in something I can't walk out of this time." Cal had asked where he was. What he needed told him to wait, that he'd come. But Jason had only laughed this short, sharp sound that had nothing of joy in it and said, "You always fix things, but this one's on me." Then silence. No goodbye. No location. Just the click of finality. A week later, they found his body in a cheap motel outside Fayetteville. Overdose. No ID. The clerk had recognized him from a flyer Cal posted. Cal had gone alone to claim the body, alone to bury him on the edge of Willow Creek Cemetery under a gray sky and a cheap headstone that read only Jason Reed, 1985-2017. May he rest. Cal had stopped asking questions after that, stopped trying to untangle the knots his friend had left behind. But now, sitting in the kitchen where a little girl who looked nothing like him slept on his couch and a woman with tired eyes carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths, he realized Jason hadn't disappeared completely. He had left something behind, someone, maybe more than one someone. Cal stared into the dark window, his own reflection staring back, and whispered the name one more time, softer now, Jason. As if saying it could bring back the parts of him that mattered. As if it might help him figure out what to do next. He hadn't gone. That was the part that stuck with Cal the most, more than the call itself, more than the funeral, more than the quiet, anonymous grave he had paid for, alone. When Jason called that night, broken and barely holding it together, Cal had listened, his hand gripping the phone so tightly the cord left a mark on his palm. He had said all the right things. Or at least he thought he had. "Stay where you are. I'll come get you, just give me an hour." But he didn't move. Not that night. Not right away. He sat on the edge of his bed, boots unlaced, staring out the dark window as the rain fell in steady sheets against the glass. He told himself it wasn't that he didn't care. He told himself Jason had done this before, cried wolf in a storm, disappeared for weeks, only to show up again with a grin and a black eye like nothing had happened. He told himself he'd leave in the morning, after sleep, after coffee, when his head was clear and he could think. But morning came, and Jason was already gone. The motel clerk said he'd checked out around 6 a.m., only he hadn't left. He'd overdosed in the bathroom, the door locked from the inside, and no one had found him until hours later when housekeeping knocked twice, then called management. Cal remembered standing in that hallway later, the bleach still strong in the air, the manager's voice dull with practiced detachment. "We get a few like this every year," the man had said, as if that somehow made it easier. But it hadn't. Not then. Not now. Cal had stood there with Jason's wallet in one hand, a photo of them as teenagers folded into the cracked leather, and all he could think about was that phone call, that voice, that chance. He hadn't gone. He'd hesitated. He'd waited too long, believing there'd be time, believing that Jason, like always, would come back from the edge. But Jason hadn't. And now, years later, as Cal sat in the same kitchen with the rain once again tapping at the windows and a girl sleeping a few rooms away, whose last name might have been Reed, He felt the weight of that night return, not as guilt exactly, but as unfinished business. Regret was a quiet thing. It didn't scream. It whispered soft, steady, patient. And now it was whispering again. It wasn't just the name. It was the way she looked at the world, quiet, precise, like she was always taking in more than she let on. It was the way her drawings showed angles most people missed, how she noticed the exact tilt of the porch railing or the knot in the wood by the stove. Cal had seen that before years ago in Jason. Back then, Jason had carried a camera everywhere, an old one with a cracked lens and duct tape holding the back shut. He'd snap photos of things that seemed ordinary, the corner of a window, the lines on someone's hand, the way the sun hit the barn roof at exactly 5:30. Cal had never understood it, but he'd admired it. Jason had seen things in layers and shadows and light, and now here was this child, Grace, with that same ability, only her tool was a pencil instead of a lens. Cal hadn't wanted to believe it at first. The name on the intake form could have been coincidence. Ellie might have scribbled it out of desperation or used it to protect someone else. But the more he watched Grace, the more he heard her silence, the more he saw Jason in her, not just in how she saw the world, but in the things she didn't say, the way she carried herself, like she already knew life could fall apart at any moment. It wasn't just resemblance, it was rhythm, soul deep. Jason had been a storm-wild, unpredictable but beautiful in his chaos. Grace was quieter, steadier, but there was a shared thread between them like a melody played in a different key. One afternoon, Cal found a drawing she'd left by the woodpile. It was of the maple tree near the fence line, same as she'd drawn it a dozen times, but this one had something new. Two small figures stood beneath it, one taller the other holding his hand. They were both facing away, looking at the horizon. Cal didn't need a caption to know who they were. She saw him now not just as the man who let her mother wash dishes and brought home bread, but as something more permanent. And that terrified him because he wasn't ready to carry what Jason had left behind. But maybe he didn't have a choice. Maybe this was the second chance Jason never got the moment Cal could do for Grace what he hadn't done for his friend. Maybe the only way to forgive himself was to stop running from the child who had unknowingly brought Jason back to him, one pencil stroke at a time. The knock came just after noon on a Thursday, sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that didn't ask permission so much as announce arrival. Cal opened the door to find a man standing on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same crooked jawline and dark eyes that once belonged to Jason, only colder, more guarded, like life had burned the softness out of him. The man extended a hand, firm and steady. "Marcus Reed," he said. "Jason's brother." Cal didn't take the hand right away. He stared at Marcus for a moment, trying to piece together how much of Jason still lived in this man, and how much had died with him. Marcus didn't flinch. "I heard there's a girl here. Grace." The name landed like a brick between them. Cal's hand dropped to his side. "Who told you that?" he asked, not hostile but not welcoming either. Marcus shrugged, stepping past the threshold without waiting to be invited. "Small towns, old friends. Somebody saw Ellie with a kid. Someone else mentioned she was staying with you. And you know how names travel, even ones buried deep." He moved through the house with practiced familiarity, like he was taking inventory. "So I did a little digging. And what do you know, a child with no birth record? A mother running scared. And that sketchbook." His eyes landed on the table where Grace had left her latest drawing, a picture of the fireplace with a kettle steaming gently. Marcus picked it up without asking. "She's got Jason's eyes," he muttered, more to himself than to Cal. Same way of seeing things. Cal watched him carefully. "What do you want?" Marcus looked up. "What's right? What's owed? Jason was my brother. If he had a kid his blood, then that child deserves to know who she is. And maybe she deserves better than this." Cal stiffened. Better than what Marcus didn't answer. He just set the drawing back down neat and precise and folded his arms. "I want to meet her," he said. "I want to know what Jason left behind." There was something in his tone that Cal didn't trust, too smooth, too certain. Grace wasn't a legacy to be claimed or a memory to be polished up for redemption. She was a little girl who drew in silence and trusted slowly, and Cal wasn't about to let her be swept into someone else's version of justice. Not without answers, not without a fight. Marcus didn't wait long to show his hand. After pacing the small living room with the confidence of a man used to being listened to, he turned to Cal with the kind of cool authority that made it clear he hadn't come here to discuss things, he'd come to claim them. "Look," he said, voice smooth but edged with steel. "I appreciate you looking out for her, for both of them. I do. But Grace is family. She's blood, and blood belongs with blood." Cal's jaw tightened. He'd heard that line before, spoken in courtrooms, whispered at funerals, used as both sword and shield to justify everything from rescue to abandonment. "So, what are you saying?" he asked, even though he already knew. Marcus crossed his arms, gaze steady. "I'm saying I've already spoken to a lawyer in Fayetteville. Once we prove paternity, and we will if the mother doesn't contest, I'm filing for custody. Legal custody. Jason's gone, but I'm still here. I've got a stable job, a house, health insurance. Ellie's been living out of a car. No schooling. No birth certificate. She's off the grid, man. That's not a life for a child." Cal stared at him, anger rising, slow but certain. "And you think this is," he asked, gesturing around the modest room, firewood stacked neatly. Grace's sketches pinned gently to the corkboard on the wall, the smell of soup still lingering from lunch. "She's safe here. She's not invisible anymore." Marcus stepped forward. "Safe isn't enough. She deserves roots, a legal name, inheritance, belonging. You don't just get to play house because you feel guilty about Jason." That landed hard. Cal didn't flinch, but he felt it, a blade beneath the skin cutting close to the bone. Marcus went on, more forceful now. "I'm her uncle, her only blood relative. That matters whether you want it to or not. Courts agree. Judges agree. And I won't let her slip through the cracks like Jason did." There was silence for a long moment. Cal's hands were steady, but his voice was low. "And what does Grace want?" Marcus blinked, thrown. "She's a kid. She doesn't know what's best." Cal nodded once. "That's where we disagree." But Marcus had already made up his mind. He wasn't here to listen. He was here to take. And in his eyes, family wasn't about who stayed when things got hard. It was about blood paperwork and names on deeds. But Cal knew better. Family wasn't something you inherited. It was something you chose day after day when no one else did. That night, long after Marcus had left with his polished shoes and veiled threats, Ellie stood by the kitchen sink, staring out the dark window with her hands gripping the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't speak when Cal came in. She didn't have to. The air around her was trembling with panic, tight and hot, like something was about to explode from the inside. Cal watched her chest rise and fall in shallow bursts, and for a moment she looked like a trapped animal, cornered, terrified, and calculating every possible escape. "He's going to take her," she said finally, her voice raw and cracking. "He's going to go to court and say all the right things, and they're going to believe him because he has a house and a job and a clean shirt and a real name, and I have nothing." Her eyes flicked toward the hallway where Grace slept, and Cal could almost see her heart breaking in real time. "I can't lose her, Cal. I can't." She ran her fingers through her hair, pacing the kitchen like the floor might vanish beneath her feet at any moment. "I've run before. I know how. I can be gone by morning. She and I will disappear again. Head west, maybe. Get new names. Start over. I can homeschool her like I've always done. She's smart. She'll be fine." But even as she said it, Cal could see the cracks in the plan forming behind her eyes. She was tired. More than tired, exhausted in her soul. The kind of exhaustion that comes from being hunted by systems and shadows for too many years, always having to explain yourself to people who never really cared to understand. "Ellie," he said gently, stepping closer, "you don't have to run." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. I always have to run. It's the only thing that's kept us together this long. Cal wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this place was different, that he would stand between her and anyone who tried to take Grace. But she wasn't listening. She was already gone in her mind, packing bags they hadn't unpacked, folding up their fragile piece like it had all been temporary anyway. He has lawyers, Cal, judges, documents. He has blood on his side. Her voice broke completely then, and all I have is her. Cal stood there helpless as Ellie crumbled into a woman undone by love, by fear, by a world that never made room for mothers like her. And somewhere in the stillness of that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about Grace anymore. It was about proving that staying could be stronger than running. Ellie was already stuffing clothes into a duffel bag when Cal stepped into the living room. Grace's sketchpad lay forgotten on the couch, her crayons scattered like dropped intentions. The girl herself was still asleep in the back room, unaware that her mother's heart was unraveling in real time. Ellie moved with frantic energy, folding shirts, rolling socks, zipping pouches with the kind of speed that came from muscle memory, the reflex of someone who had learned to disappear before questions caught up. Her back was to Cal when she said, "We'll be gone before sunrise. I won't let him touch her." Cal stood frozen for a moment, watching the way her shoulders tensed, the way her breath hitched each time she turned toward the door and back again, like she was trying to outrun a decision she'd already made. "Ellie," he said, voice even. She didn't stop packing. "Don't," she snapped. "Don't try to talk me out of this. You heard what he said. You saw the way he looked at her like she was some name to be filed a box to check. He doesn't care about her. He cares about ownership, about control." She shoved a sweater into the bag and yanked the zipper closed. "I've done this before. I can do it again." "You don't have to," Cal said quietly. "Yes, I do." Her voice cracked, now raw with something deeper than panic. "You think the system is going to protect us? You think some judge is going to see a homeless woman with no paperwork and pick her over the clean-cut uncle in a blazer? They'll take her, Cal. They'll tear her from my arms and hand her to a stranger just because his name's printed on a bank statement." Cal took a step forward. "Ellie." She turned, finally facing him, eyes blazing. "You don't understand. You've never had to live like we have. One mistake, one form left blank, and the whole world turns on you. I can't let that happen again. I won't." He didn't flinch. He just looked at her. Really looked and said, "I'm not going to let them take her." The words hung in the air like something sacred. Ellie blinked, stunned into stillness. Cal continued slower now, deliberate. "You're right. The system doesn't always do what's right, but this time it's not just you and Grace. I'm here now. And I don't care what Marcus says or what lawyer he hires or what name is on a birth certificate. That girl is safe here. With you, with me. And I swear to you, I will not let them take her." Ellie's breath caught her hand, still gripping the handle of the bag. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you fight for us?" Cal didn't hesitate. "Because I should have fought for Jason, and I didn't. And because Grace isn't just his daughter. She's a child who's finally found a place to belong. I won't let fear take that away." For the first time, Ellie let the bag fall to the floor. Her arms dropped to her sides, her expression shifting from defiance to something quieter, something dangerously close to hope. And for the first time in years, she didn't run. For the weeks that followed, the cabin at Willow Creek took on a stillness so deep it felt sacred, like the hush that follows snowfall, or the breath held just before a song begins. Ellie, Grace, and Cal moved through the days with a quiet rhythm, each gesture measured, each moment filled with something unspoken but understood. Ellie no longer spoke of leaving. The duffel bag stayed folded beneath the bed untouched, and her eyes, once darting and anxious, had softened into something steadier. She took over the morning coffee, learning Cal's old percolator with patient hands. Grace, once cautious and mute, now spent her afternoons drawing not just trees and furniture, but people, three figures over and over again. A tall man with broad shoulders, a woman with messy hair tied back, and a little girl always holding one of their hands. She didn't call them anything out loud, but she drew them like they were real. Cal noticed. He didn't say it, but the pictures lined the wall near the fireplace now like a private gallery of something he was starting to believe in. He fixed the fence. Ellie planted herbs in old pots. Grace asked for more yellow crayons. And though no one used the word family, it hovered in the air between them, not needing to be spoken to be true. At night they sat on the porch, while the cicadas hummed their lullabies and the stars blinked like secrets. Ellie would hum under her breath, while Grace curled beside her and Cal, who had spent years speaking only to trees, and Silence found he didn't mind the company. He didn't ask about Jason again. She didn't offer. Some truths were still too sharp, but they existed side by side now, not out of necessity, but choice, until the letter arrived. It came on a Monday, folded neatly in a plain envelope, the kind that looked harmless until it wasn't. Cal found it wedged in the mailbox alongside a seed catalog and a water bill. The return address was stamped with the county seal, the type crisp and official. He didn't need to open it to know what it meant. When he handed it to Ellie, she didn't speak for a long time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper and scanned the contents. Notice of hearing it read. Custody determination. Petition filed by Marcus Reed. Scheduled court appearance in 3 weeks. Required presence. Cal watched her face fall, watched the color drain, slowly watched the soft stillness of their fragile peace tighten back into panic. Grace stood at the doorway, clutching her drawing of the three of them, unaware of the words that threatened to undo them. Ellie looked up finally, her voice flat. It's happening. Cal nodded, once his voice low, but resolute. Then we show up. We don't run. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in paper shields and courtroom truth. But all she could hear in her chest was the sound of footsteps behind her, always catching up. The storm came not with thunder, but with paperwork. Marcus Reed didn't waste time. Within a week of the court summons, he had secured a well-dressed attorney from a firm in Fayetteville, someone with the kind of voice that made judges lean in, and the kind of teeth that smiled without kindness. The lawyer's name was Garrett Cole, and from the moment he entered the case, everything turned colder. Cal and Ellie received the first official letter from CPS 2 days later, delivered by hand and signed in blue ink that tried to disguise the sharpness of its contents. Ellie was required to appear for an evaluation to provide documentation proving her capacity to care for Grace. Medical records, housing stability, proof of income, school plans, safety assurances. Things she didn't have. Things she'd never needed while surviving in the margins of the world. She read the letter aloud, only once her voice steady, until the final line. Failure to comply may result in temporary removal of the child until custody can be determined. That line hit harder than anything Marcus had said. Cal stood in the doorway as she sat at the table, her fingers clenching the paper like it might fight back. Grace was in the next room, humming softly as she organized her crayons, unaware that her world was beginning to split at the seams. Ellie looked up at Cal, her eyes dark with a tired kind of dread. "They're not just trying to take her," she said. "They're trying to erase me." CPS sent a caseworker the following morning, a young woman named Brenna, with a soft voice and a tablet she never stopped tapping on. She walked through the cabin, noted the fire extinguisher, the locks on the windows, the stocked pantry. She smiled politely, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "These things matter," she said, "but unfortunately, so do records." Ellie had no tax returns, no lease, no medical files proving consistent care. Grace had never been enrolled in a public school. Everything Ellie had done to protect her child, keeping her off the grid, avoiding systems that might separate them, was now being used as evidence of neglect. Garrett Cole filed motions to expedite the hearing. Marcus submitted a personal affidavit declaring his intent to offer a stable, legally recognized home. Ellie's story wasn't even on the page yet, and already the scales were tilting. Cal watched it all happen with a slow-burning fury. He didn't say much, But in the silence, he began to build something stronger than fear resolve. The idea came to Cal in the middle of the night, not like a lightning bolt, but more like a slow, rising tide, inevitable, steady, and impossible to ignore. He couldn't watch them lose. Not like this. The system didn't care how many drawings Grace left on the walls, or how many nights Ellie stayed awake counting her breaths beside her daughter's sleeping form. The system wanted signatures, names in boxes, legitimacy in ink. And if Ellie couldn't give them that, at least not fast enough, then maybe he could. So the next morning, over coffee gone cold and silence thick as the fog rolling off Willow Creek, Cal said it. "I'll do it," he said quietly. Ellie looked up, her eyes already wary. Do what be her temporary guardian, on paper. Just until the hearing. We file an emergency petition. It's legal, it's clean, and it gives us time. Her face twisted before the words even settled. "You want me to give her up to you?" "No," he said, gently but firmly. "I want to keep her with you. And this may be the only way to do that." Ellie pushed back from the table, her hands flat, her voice sharp with panic. "You think they're going to see your name and forget mine? That some old man in a flannel shirt can just swoop in and make this all okay?" Cal didn't flinch. "They don't need to forget you. They need to see that Grace is safe, that she has someone rooted in this town, someone they trust. But you're not her father. Neither is Marcus," he said, and the words landed with more weight than either of them expected. "But he's got money, lawyers, and a clean suit. I've got this house, a record, stability, and a reason to fight." Ellie's breath shook. "You don't understand. If I sign that paper, I've already lost her." "No," he said. "If you don't, they'll take her before we even walk into court." The truth hung between them, bitter and undeniable. Finally, after a long silence, Ellie sank into the chair like someone who had just realized the shore was farther away than she thought. "You swear to me," she whispered, "that this doesn't mean you get to keep her." Cal nodded slowly. "I swear. She's yours. I'm just the anchor until the storm passes." And though the pain in her eyes didn't fade, she reached for the pen. Not because she trusted the system, but because for once, she didn't have to run from someone standing beside her. The courtroom was too big for its purpose, ceilings too high, fluorescent lights too bright, and every sound echoing like a verdict. Ellie sat stiffly beside Cal, her hands folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles had turned white. Cal, silent and steady, had his jaw locked, watching the judge with the same focus he once used to study shifting winds on the creek. Across the room, Marcus Reed sat in a pressed gray suit flanked by his lawyer, Garrett Cole, who wore his confidence like armor. Grace sat between them, smaller than anyone in the room seemed to remember. She swung her legs under the bench, crayon-smudged fingers, clutching a thick sheet of paper she had refused to let go of all morning. No one noticed her at first, not really. The adults were busy trading language sharper than knives' best interests, unfit biological rights, legal stability. Ellie's heart broke at every phrase. She wanted to scream that love couldn't be measured by income brackets or dental records, but her voice had long since retreated somewhere deep inside her, too tired to rise. Then Grace moved. Without a word, she slid off the bench, clutching her drawing in both hands. The judge glanced down, eyebrows raised. "Miss Grace, do you want to speak?" Grace didn't speak. She never had in public before, but now, without looking at either lawyer, she walked straight to the bench and held up her drawing like an offering. There were 3 people under a wooden porch, a tall man with a beard, a woman with her hair pulled back, and a little girl standing between them. Rain fell in the picture, but the porch was dry. At the bottom, in careful block letters shaped by a child who didn't speak, but always understood, one word was written in pencil. Stay. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge took the drawing, gently studying it for a long moment before glancing at Grace, then Ellie, then Cal. "Is this your family?" he asked softly. Grace didn't nod. She just stepped back and returned to her seat, her hands empty, but her message louder than any argument offered that day. For a moment, even Marcus didn't move. Garrett Cole leaned over to whisper something into his ear, but Marcus just stared ahead, lips pressed tight, as if that single word, stay, had made him realize what all his arguments never could. That love doesn't always come with documents. Sometimes it comes in drawings, and sometimes the smallest voice says the most. The judge sat still for a long moment after Grace returned to her seat, the child's drawing still in his hands, his eyes lingering on the single word scrawled at the bottom. Stay. The silence in the courtroom felt heavier than any gavel. No one dared speak. Ellie's breath was caught somewhere in her chest. Her fingers curled so tightly into the hem of her coat that the threads strained. Cal didn't look at her. He couldn't. His eyes fixed firmly on the man in the black robe who now held not only the picture, but the fragile future of a little girl who had never spoken a single word aloud, and yet had said more than any adult could. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and set the drawing down gently in front of him like it was something sacred. "This is not a standard case," he said quietly, "and so it will not receive a standard decision." Garrett Cole shifted, clearly ready to object, but the judge held up a hand. "Sit down, counselor." He looked over his glasses at Marcus. "Mr. Reed, your intentions may be well-meaning, but a courtroom is not a place for redemption. It is a place for what is in the child's best interest." He then turned to Ellie. "Ms. Monroe, your past, however unconventional, shows no signs of neglect, abuse, or deliberate harm. In fact, what we have witnessed today is evidence of deep emotional safety and attachment." Ellie's lips parted slightly, but she remained still stunned. The judge continued, turning now toward Cal. "Mr. Dawson, your willingness to assume temporary guardianship in the interest of protecting a child you have no legal obligation to is not only commendable, but compelling." Then came the words that would remain etched in all their memories. "Effective immediately, Grace Monroe shall remain in the care of Eleanor Monroe, and under the temporary guardianship of Calvin Dawson. However, the court will assign a child welfare officer to conduct monthly evaluations for the next 6 months. This is not a punishment, it is a protection, and it applies to all parties involved. Stability must be earned as well as claimed." Ellie exhaled, finally, the release of air sounding like disbelief and relief braided together. Marcus said nothing. He looked at the floor, jaw tight, but nodded once when the judge's gaze met his. The case was closed with no loud bang of the gavel, just a quiet nod, a folded piece of paper, and a little girl's drawing that had changed everything. They had not won in triumph. They had stayed, and that the judge had decided was enough. Marcus didn't say a word as he left the courthouse. The polished confidence that had carried him through every deposition, every affidavit, and every carefully worded motion had melted into something quieter, acceptance maybe, or the hollow ache of understanding something too late. He didn't look at Ellie or Cal. He didn't glance at Grace, who clutched Cal's hand tightly as they stepped into the pale sunlight outside the courthouse steps. Instead, Marcus walked with slow, measured steps to his car, the door closing with a soft finality. He never looked back. Ellie watched him go with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She didn't hate him, not really. He had fought in the only way he knew how, with documents and legal claims and the weight of a family name. But what he didn't understand, what he never could, was that Grace didn't need someone who shared her blood. She needed someone who had stayed. Cal, quiet as always, didn't gloat. He simply kept his hand in Grace's, grounding her, steadying her, knowing full well that the battle wasn't entirely over. That afternoon, before they left the courthouse, a social worker pulled Cal aside, an older woman with kind eyes and a clipboard full of quiet warnings. "You've done right by her," she said softly. "But temporary guardianship isn't forever. You'll need to start the adoption process if you want to make this permanent. Paper matters, Mr. Dawson, even when the love's already there." Cal nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't let himself imagine that far ahead, not yet. But when he glanced down at Grace, who was drawing another picture in the corner of the waiting room, this time with 3 hearts above the porch roof, He knew the answer before he even let the thought fully form. He wanted to stay. Not just in the cabin, not just in her life. He wanted to belong to her as much as she belonged to them. Ellie sat beside him later on the porch back home in Willow Creek, the air thick with the scent of pine and the lingering hum of cicadas. She didn't say much, just looked at him with that same gaze she'd had the day they first arrived, tired, searching, and quietly fierce. "You'd really do it?" she asked. Cal didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "I already have." And for the first time, Ellie smiled not with fear or apology, but with something closer to peace. They sat together on the porch that evening, the sky painted in soft oranges and purples as the sun dipped behind the hills of Willow Creek. Grace had fallen asleep inside her sketch pad, resting gently on her chest, the newest drawing half-finished 3 figures under a tree with the porch in the background and tiny golden stars beginning to appear above them. Cal leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring out at the quiet woods that had once been his only companions. Ellie sat beside him, arms folded, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor she wasn't ready to take off. The peace between them was fragile, but real, stitched together by weeks of shared silence and small kindnesses. But Ellie's voice when she spoke carried something heavier. "If you leave," she said quietly, not looking at him, "if you disappear the way people do when things settle, if you walk away like Jason did, like everyone always does." She paused, then turned her eyes toward him. "She won't draw anymore." Cal turned to her, something twisting in his chest. Ellie wasn't accusing him. She wasn't trying to guilt him. She was telling the truth. Grace's drawings had been more than pictures. They had been proof of hope, of presence, of something lasting. For a girl who had once said nothing, her sketches had been her language and her anchor. "You saw what she drew in court." Ellie continued, her voice tight. "She didn't plead or cry or beg. She drew a home. She drew you. That was her way of asking you to stay." Her fingers gripped the blanket tighter. "And if you go now, if you pull away, she'll stop asking. She'll stop believing." Cal swallowed the weight of her words sitting deep in his gut. He had spent years hiding in the woods, telling himself that staying away was a kind of safety. But now he saw the damage that distance left behind, how absence had shaped this girl's life before he'd even known her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not now. Not ever." Ellie didn't smile. Not yet. But something in her posture loosened just enough to show that maybe for the first time in a long time she believed someone might actually mean it. Inside, Grace stirred in her sleep, one hand still resting on her drawing as if afraid it might blow away. 1 year later, the sun rose over Willow Creek the same way it always did, slowly, gently casting a golden hue across the tops of the trees and onto the narrow 2-lane road that curved past the courthouse and into the heart of town. But for Cal, Ellie, and Grace this morning felt different. It felt like arrival. The 3 of them walked up the steps of the county records office, Grace's small hand tucked in Ellie's, her other holding tightly to a worn sketchbook that had traveled with her through everything. Cal, dressed in his best flannel shirt and clean jeans, kept just behind them, his presence quiet but steady, like it had always been. The woman at the front desk looked up with mild curiosity as they approached, but her face softened when she saw the little girl standing between them. Ellie took a breath and spoke clearly. "We're here to register Grace's birth certificate." Her voice no longer trembled the way it used to. The clerk nodded, sliding a stack of papers across the counter, her tone warm but professional. "Parental information, date of birth, legal guardianship documentation. We'll need signatures from both of you." Ellie and Cal sat side by side at the long wooden table, Grace perched between them, drawing quietly, her crayons forming soft loops of color on a spare sheet of printer paper. When Ellie picked up the pen, her hand didn't hesitate. For the first time in her daughter's life, she was no longer invisible to the law, no longer temporary. Cal signed after her, not as a man doing someone a favor, but as a father, because that's who he had become in the spaces between words, in the steady presence through storms, and in every moment he had chosen not to leave. The woman behind the desk reviewed the paperwork with practiced efficiency, then paused. "Do you want her name to remain Grace Monroe?" Ellie looked at Cal, then at Grace, who smiled without looking up from her drawing. "Grace Monroe Dawson," Ellie said softly. The clerk nodded, typed a few strokes, and printed the certificate, new ink on official paper, marking something that had always been true in their hearts. As they left the office, Grace held the paper in her hands like it was something precious. She didn't speak, but she drew a small check mark in the corner of her notebook, beside a sketch of 3 people beneath a roof. Above them, she had written one word in big looping letters: belong. As they stood at the counter waiting for the final processing of Grace's official birth certificate, the county records clerk, a kind older man with silver hair and glasses that slid down his nose, paused as he skimmed the paperwork one last time. He looked up at Cal and Ellie with a gentle but inquisitive gaze, tapping his pen lightly on the designated line at the bottom of the form. "Father," he asked, his tone neutral, almost apologetic, as if he were used to this part of the form being complicated. For a split second the air felt heavier, as if 1,000 untold stories had just settled into that one word. Ellie turned slightly toward Cal, her expression unreadable, but her eyes soft. Cal didn't speak right away. He looked down at Grace, who stood beside him, her hand resting calmly on his arm, as if it belonged there, as if it had always belonged there. Grace didn't say anything she didn't need to. Her drawings over the past year had said it all. She had drawn him fishing with her at the creek. She had drawn him fixing her shoe. She had drawn him tucking her in, waiting by the window, walking beside her in the snow, and in every picture, he was the one who stayed. Cal finally met the clerk's eyes and nodded once. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm her father." The clerk gave a small smile, one that carried quiet understanding rather than judgment. He made a neat notation on the form, then passed it back for Cal's signature. Cal took the pen with steady fingers and wrote his name, Calvin Dawson, on the line where once there had been a blank. His handwriting was slow, careful, and deliberate, each letter an act of commitment. Ellie watched him sign, her throat tight with emotion she didn't try to hide. She had spent so long doing everything on her own, building invisible walls to protect the only thing that ever mattered, Grace. But here, in this quiet government office with fluorescent lights and beige walls, something inside her exhaled. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a promise. The clerk nodded again, stamped the form, and slid it into a protective sleeve before handing it to Ellie. "Congratulations," he said gently. "Your family's now official." As they turned to leave, Grace slipped her hand into Cal's and looked up at him, wide-eyed but peaceful. She didn't speak, but later in the car she handed him a drawing, the same 3 figures standing beneath the sun, with one word in bold, colorful letters above their heads: Dad. Ellie hesitated for just a moment, the pen poised between her fingers, the final form resting flat on the desk in front of her. The county clerk had stepped away to retrieve the embossed seal, leaving them alone in the quiet office. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting golden streaks across the floor, and in that hush, everything seemed to slow. Cal stood a few steps behind, hands in his pockets, not pressuring, not assuming, just waiting. He had done a lot of that over the past year. Waiting, not demanding. Showing up, not explaining. Offering presence instead of promises. Ellie glanced down at the blank line again, Father's name. She felt the weight of everything that had come before, the nights spent hiding in the back seat of an abandoned car, the terror of being found, the quiet defiance of survival. There had been a time when she'd thought she'd never trust anyone again, and now here she was, holding a pen above a line that asked her to define who they were. That's when she felt the soft tug at her sleeve. Grace, standing beside her barefoot in her worn sneakers, looked up at her with those dark, thoughtful eyes that had always seen more than most children her age. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more power than any shout. "Write his name." Ellie's breath caught. Grace had only recently begun to speak quiet words, chosen carefully like each one mattered, and this one did. Ellie turned to look at Cal. He was still there, silent, watching, with something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite fear, but something in between. Something like faith. She remembered all the times she had doubted him, questioned his reasons, assumed he would one day walk away like everyone else had. But he hadn't. He had stayed. Every morning, every meal, every scraped knee, every cold night. And more than that, he had never once asked for this. Never asked to be named. He had simply earned it. With slow fingers, Ellie brought the pen to the line. She didn't look up again. She didn't speak. She just wrote, Calvin Dawson. And when she finished, she slid the form forward and folded her hands, breathing out the fear that had clung to her for far too long. Grace leaned into her side and smiled. Not the shy, uncertain smile of a girl used to hiding, but the kind that came from knowing something good was finally undeniably real. Some people don't enter our lives with noise. They arrive quietly with no promises, no grand gestures, just the steady decision to stay. That's how Cal Dawson saved Grace. Not with big words, but with a bowl of soup, an unlocked door, and a front gate with her name written in chalk. This story reminds us that family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by who chooses to stay. Real love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up and keeps showing up day after day. If you've ever felt abandoned, forgotten, or like you didn't belong anywhere, please remember this: there is still a place for you. Someone is still waiting. Some porch light is still on just for you. Drop a comment below if this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone special. Save this video so you can return to it on hard days. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful emotional stories that remind us of what truly matters. You never know whose life your share might change. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay kind, stay present, and keep the light on for someone.